Track that forward to the present day. And I think that this is where debates on justification are not passé. Justification is the reason for Protestantism's existence, ultimately, because all of the distinctive Protestant doctrines really devolve from justification. If justification is to become a doctrine that is simply negotiable, or one minor thing among many, or that the Protestant church has got fundamentally wrong, I mean this rhetorically. I'm not advising you to go out and do it, but I'm going to say we have no reason for being Protestants anymore. The positive reason for Protestantism to exist is first and foremost justification. And then as it connects to all of these issues of authority and perspicuity. If the Protestant church got justification wrong, we should all be Catholics. And I'm not advising you to go off and become Catholics. I'm putting it that way in order to highlight to you how important this doctrine is. Faith and justification are not just one doctrine among a handful of things like church order that we can agree to differ on. Justification is one of the central doctrines that determines the nature of Protestantism and the reason for the existence of Protestantism. In aesthetically compelling ways by popular culture. When the history gets written in 100, 150 years' time, it would not surprise me that a soap opera like Will and Grace, or sitcom like Will and Grace, will prove to have been far more significant than anything coming out of an Ivy League philosophy ethics department. And I think one of the perennial dangers among professors is that we tend to overestimate the power of argument and ideas and underestimate the powers of the media of popular culture. And those media have changed dramatically and become very, very pervasive and powerful in the last 10, 15, 20 years in a way that guys of my generation are having to play catch-up in order to understand what's going on here. To draw an analogy with Luther, one of the remarkable things about Luther that makes him so successful is that even though he's basically middle-aged by the time the Reformation begins, he has an uncanny understanding of how the print medium operates. I think a lot of professors training students today don't understand how popular media shapes people's ideas. I remember a few years ago in class, a student was saying to me, can you give me some good arguments against gay marriage? And I said, well, I can, but there's not a lot of point. I said, because none of your friends believe in it because of any arguments. It's because they have an aesthetic view of love, they're drenched in sentimentalism, and they have all these soap opera and sitcom plot lines whizzing through their synapses telling them that why would you stop two people who love each other being happy? So that's not an argument, that's an aesthetic. So I can give you arguments, but they're going to be no good even if people are polite enough to sit and listen. So I think that's something that probably my generation need to reflect long and hard on. It's what makes me most pessimistic about the future, that the sheer strength of the media of pop culture in so many different ways, it looks to me as if we just can't resist it. It's great to have colleges like Patrick Henry or Hillsdale or Grove City that represent traditional conservative, not necessarily politically conservative, but traditional conservative ways of thinking, but like drops in the ocean compared to the tidal wave of popular culture out there. So I'm very pessimistic on that front. Then I think we have to go to Luther's quotation to say, well, the Word of God is still powerful. It's still powerful. I just don't see it being very powerful in America at the moment, but we can hope and pray that the Lord will use His preached word to transform hearts and minds once again. And I think, go to the New Testament. Paul clearly envisages a hierarchy. clearly thinks about authority. And even if we set aside Congregationalist versus Presbyterian questions, when Paul's writing to Timothy towards the end of his life, the things that he's telling Timothy to do are hold fast to a form of sound words, keep the faith, oh, by the way, and put men into positions of eldership and diaconal authority. He sees the need for the church to have an authority. I think that's something the church needs to recover. I fear in my own denomination, the OPC, we've so emphasized that we've actually produced some countercultural problems, that we have too hierarchical a view of the ministry, so that sometimes the minister can almost be priest-like in my sort of circles, and that's a problem. But I fear that is not the generic American Protestant problem. I think the generic American Protestant problem is more likely to be everybody does what is right in their own eyes, and you cannot hold me to account. And one of the telltale signs in any church is to ask, when was the last discipline case? When did you actually take your confession of faith seriously enough to kick somebody out who was thumbing their nose at the church consistently on this? When was the last time somebody cheated on their wife and was held to account by the church in your church? Because if your church has 150 people, somebody will have done that over 10 years. Were they held to account? I think that's the telltale way of finding out if a church takes hierarchy seriously. It's important in the New Testament, and it should be important to us today, but there are strong impulses, particularly within the sort of radical individualism of America, that militate against that. And that's not a criticism of the radical individualism of America. I think that's what made America great, in the same way that Luther's bullheadedness made him great at the Diet of Worms, but it also meant there were certain problems with Luther later. And I think radical individualism has both great strengths, but one needs to be aware of the drawbacks as well.
He declared that the church's dogmatic role, doctrinal role, was twofold: to teach the saints the truth of God's word, and to protest the teaching, values, and behavior of the world around. The church proclaims the kingship of Christ through cross and resurrection. These are moral and intellectual affronts to the world. By proclaiming them in both preaching and confession, the church nurtures her members and stands as witness against the sin and rebellion of the world. This is a most useful point at this moment in time. There are always those in the church who see the church as the problem. That the church's teaching is offensive to the world around is seen as an indictment of her testimony, her failure to love those outside and to listen to their concerns. Even in the last few weeks, I've read precisely such thoughts expressed by Presbyterian church ministers with regard to current debates about sexuality. Regardless of specific instances where the church has acted inappropriately and caused an offense which is not that of the gospel, we do well to note Bannerman's understanding of doctrinal confession as protest, for it is simply the application of Paul's own teaching with regard to the cross of Christ. It is of the essence of the church's testimony to be a protest against the philosophies, values, and behavior of the outside world, whether they be sexual, monetary, or ideological. As Bannerman's point makes clear, that which is necessary to build up the saints is necessarily that which protests the world. And the tools by which she makes her protest are simple: the public worship of God according to his word, the very existence of which worship is an act of protest and defiance against the powers of this world.
In 1659, a few years later, Bunyan published The Doctrine of the Law and Grace Unfolded, which explains his view of covenant theology, stressing the promissory nature of the covenant of grace and the dichotomy between law and grace. That book helped establish him as a thoroughgoing Calvinist, though it led to false charges against him, charges of antinomianism, by none other than Richard Baxter. If any Puritan is going to charge you of antinomianism, Baxter is a good one to do it. Because Baxter himself was unsound on justification by faith, as you probably know.
Today, my topic for this morning is the church as persecuted. Consider this question. Would you still believe in Jesus Christ even when a gun is pointed at you? Would you still believe in Jesus Christ if a gun were to be pointed at you? This sounds a bit over the top, I realize, and perhaps unbelievable to many, and perhaps a joke that kids play as teenagers. But this question was not uncommon in the church Sunday school programs in South Korea during the 60s and 70s and 80s. Let me explain why. During its occupation of Korea, during the first half of the 20th century, the colonial government of Japan introduced measures aimed at promoting the Japanese national spirit, so-called, by eradicating Korean traditions and civilization as a whole. A part of this plan involved erecting Shinto shrines in every city and major town, and over 400 shrines were built during that time. As a nation where religion and state were intertwined intimately and often indiscriminately, one thing that you recognize is that Shintoism, as Japan's state religion, undergirded the deification of the emperor and the allegiance to the empire. Koreans, regardless of religion, were required to go and bow at the shrines, participating in worship ceremonies to the sun goddess, from whom descended the emperor of the empire. Though initially resisted by the churches, the heightening level of oppression and the rising factions within the church desiring some kind of peace and conciliation led to the capitulation of many denominations and churches in Korea, including the Presbyterian Church of Korea, founded in 1912. At its 27th General Assembly in 1938, which took place in Pyongyang, a city perhaps most familiar to you because it's the capital of present North Korea, 400 plus delegates met and passed without debate or even a negative vote a resolution approving Shinto worship. By following the guidance of the government, they said, and adjusting to the national policy on group organization, we will get rid of the wrong idea of depending on Europe and America and do our best to readjust and purify Japanese Christianity. The statement further said, like other people, the church members should attend the shrine worship, was the declaration. Many objected to such a public and complete capitulation, often at the point of a gun. By rough estimation, more than 2,000 ministers and elders of the church were imprisoned, 50 or so were martyred, and more than 150 churches were destroyed or closed down. One name from that era that might be familiar to many listeners this morning is a name of Bruce Hunt, in Korean, Han Bu-sun, a missionary from the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. When he was arrested, he was asked, "But we Japanese believe our emperor is a god. Why should we have to believe in your Western God?" the inquisitor asked. He answered, "He is not only God of the West, he is the God of the whole earth." When he answered this way, he was then asked, "Do you believe then that the Japanese emperor must also believe in this so-called Jesus?" Bruce Hunt answered, "Yes, I believe the Japanese emperor must believe in Jesus to be saved. He is a mere man, and as such, according to the Bible, he is a sinner like the rest of us and in need of salvation. If he does not believe in Jesus, he must suffer eternal punishment." This was him sitting in prison answering this question, to which the inquisitor replied, "You surely have your nerve," he said. Friends, when you are only a generation or two removed from such persecutions, realities passed on from parents to children, grandparents to their grandkids, the question I began with, simply asking, would you still believe in Jesus even if a gun is pointed at you, seems less dramatic and perhaps even necessary for Christians and all believers. Discussions of opposition persecution, suffering of the church seem distant and almost quaint to many of us. This sense of unfamiliarity indicates how separated we are from the experience of most Christians even now around the globe, and for many Christians in the first century as recorded in the Bible.
You live in the land. But in the new covenant, when we ourselves are exiles, what does it look like from sojourner to sojourner? What does neighbor love look like from exile to exile? Whether for those who happen to live in the land of their birth, or for those who are refugees and exiles in a kind of double sense. Does that thought make any sense? I'm hoping to invite some thoughts on that.
Are you asking me, Ryan, or are you asking just generally for all the speakers?
Anyone really, but you're unmuted. So such is the nature of Zoom.
Yeah, it's kind of intriguing. I'm not sure if I fully comprehend the depth of your question. And my guess is that this can be reflected in different layers and different textures as well. I am an immigrant. What that means, just briefly, means that I came to the States having been born in a different country. So having been born and raised in Korea for about the first 10 years of my life, I came to the States as an immigrant family, naturalized into our citizenship. Dr. Johnson mentioned earlier in our Q&A about the importance that Paul places on the notion that we are heavenly citizens. And it's not by chance that we recognize that for Paul, who can find his identity as a Roman in terms of his citizenship, a Jew in terms of his upbringing and ethnicity, a Greek in terms of his training and education in the city in which he found himself, identified with none of those. And it's not by chance the one who was abused by the Jews, the one who was tried by the Romans, the one who was abandoned by the Greeks is the one who's actually translating for us and teaching us what it means to live on this side of glory as a pilgrim and a sojourner, not belonging anywhere. And I think one thing that I learned fairly quickly as a young man growing up in a new country was, though I love the country and I love the country that I left, I love the new country in which I find myself, I didn't really belong. I'm a bit of a misfit. We talked about earlier before, but certainly the concept of being a misfit is everywhere. Lots of people call me different things. Some people call me Korean American with a hyphen in between. Koreans call themselves a 1.5 Korean. What that means is a first generation is an older adult who came to the States. A second generation is someone who was born in the States. Someone like me, they call 1.5, who is culturally and linguistically adept, but yet belonging to neither place. Now, people look at that and say, well, it's because you possess the positive of both, the first and second, or the Korean or the American. I take that to mean simply, I don't belong anywhere. You're kind of stuck in between through the cracks. You're neither fully Korean nor fully American. You're neither fully first generation or fully second generation. Now, I say that not as a self-pity. There was a time where that was self-pity, but I take that as the Lord's providence in placing me where I am, recognizing that this is certainly not my home. This is not because I don't love the States. It's not because I don't love the food, nor the culture, nor the language. I love all of that. To be honest, same thing with Korea and the culture and the food that's there. But like someone who's a sojourner, you identify and you receive the blessings of all these things, but you're not there permanently. You have a passport in your pocket that tells you your rights and privileges are elsewhere. And therefore, you live with the joy, as well as sometimes the pain of being someone who is a sojourner in one place as a misfit, and that not fitting in and being weird, those things are not necessarily negative things for us, but those things remind us that we belong somewhere else. Always a daily reminder that we are just in a stop in a subway, if we know subways, but that we have a home and the final destination to which we must head. And I realize that your question is much more deeper than that. I recognize, but I do wonder about that sometimes we are over-identified with our time, with our place, with our culture, with the preferences that we have, when really the rights and privileges that we hold dearer and dearest is elsewhere.
Therefore able to behave and to act in certain ways. Indwelling sin, the game of indwelling sin is to distort your identity. And anything that indwelling sin can get its hands on that will distort your identity is useful to it. I would suggest today one of the most powerful ways of that occurring is through the television. As Christians, we often worry most about sex and violence on the television. We don't want to see stuff that we feel will make us enjoy sin or will make us have thoughts, unbecoming thoughts that we shouldn't have. I think indwelling sin is much more subtle in the way that it appropriates the signals from our culture. The analogy I make for the television is things like sex and violence on the television. What are they? Well, they're the equivalent of looking out of your window on a Saturday morning. You can hear a noise down the street, you look out of your window, and there is somebody walking down the street wearing a hockey goalie mask with a chainsaw which has blood dripping from it. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to lock your door and you're going to phone the police. You're going to want the guy taken out as soon as possible. The danger is obvious. If you go out into the street, you're going to get dismembered by a lunatic with a chainsaw. You don't have to be a genius to spot that one. You lock your door and you sit inside, and you're dead within half an hour. Why? Because your heating system's malfunctioning and it's pumping carbon monoxide into your house. And you don't even know there's a problem until it's too late. Carbon monoxide, I'm told, is scentless. You can't tell that it's there. It's why we have to have carbon monoxide alarms in our houses to keep us safe. Those are the more deadly aspects of culture from the perspective of indwelling sin. And if indwelling sin is in the game of changing your understanding of who you are in order then to be able to fundamentally transform your kind of behavior, you need to be aware of the things that are coming to you from the culture that change your understanding of who you are. And I would suggest that commercials are probably far more deadly and far more dangerous to most people and most families than sex and violence. Why? Because you can see the sex and violence, it's obvious, and you can press the off switch. You can avoid it. Commercials send subliminal signals. What is the basic message of a commercial? Buy this and your life will be more fulfilled. Buy this and you will achieve a level of human perfection that you don't currently enjoy. Let's do the Augustine thing on that and take that back a stage and say, what is that message fundamentally sending to us? What is the basic message being sent there? You are God. You can create yourself. You can be anything you want to be. You can buy this thing and you can change who you are in some fundamental way. And guess what? That's exactly the message that indwelling sin loves to hear because it can capitalize on. The basic message of a purpose of indwelling sin is to change your understanding of your own identity, to make you think that you are God. And when commercials come at you from the outside, they sing exactly that tune and fuel exactly that thought within your mind. One of the most commonly misunderstood concepts in the doctrine of God, of course, is immutability and impassibility. You'll often hear that dismissed as, oh, well, you're describing God as some kind of inert, unmoved mover. But of course, the early church fathers are not doing that. God is impassible and immutable because he is abundant life. God is not closer to a rock than he is to us in his being, if you like. He's much further away from a rock than we are because he is absolutely abundant life to the extent that nothing can be added to him.
that will improve him or make him more alive or more existent. And that's something I think that, that's just a simple example of where we have this classical language that sometimes grates on the ear today because it sounds as if it's actually conveying something that can't possibly be justified from the Bible. But when you do the digging in the tradition, you realize, no, actually it's designed precisely to reflect what the Bible teaches. Faith there in a way that Owen is gunning for men he thinks are enemies of the faith. I'm dealing with a misguided brother at that point. I think beware of some of the rhetoric that you find in these 17th century guys, but get deep into what they're talking and arguing about. Know your confessions. As dean at Westminster, one of my jobs was when we brought new faculty on was to ask them, any exceptions to the confession. And it was always interesting to me how chapter 2, the language is so alien to us, without parts and passions, makes God sound like that cold rock I was talking about early on. It was interesting to me how often very high-powered men coming for faculty positions who were really very orthodox and very well-grounded in their fields didn't quite grasp what the confession was trying to say at that point. So I would say, get hold of the confession. Look up those words. Get Richard Muller's Dictionary of Latin and Greek Theological Terms. It's come out in the second edition. If there's a term in the confession that confuses you, look it up in Muller's dictionary. He will send you off to some sources to see what those terms actually meant and why they were framed in the way they were. The 17th century divines didn't want to portray God as cold and inert. That was not what they were getting at. What they wanted to do was portray a God who undergirded the reliability of the covenants and of salvation.
I'd like to just add to that, and going back to your message this morning, Stephen, about tradition. Sometimes we choke on the word because of the negative connotations from Jesus' rebuke of the Pharisees, because they substituted their traditions for the Word of God. And so that sin of replacing the truth of God with the traditions of men is something we have to be careful of in every generation. Yet at the same time, the Apostle Paul, when he would teach, he would say, I teach to you what I have received. And he talked about the paradosis, the tradition. And in that case, it wasn't the human tradition, but the apostolic tradition, which was the giving over of the truth that came to us initially from God, and then through the prophets and through the apostles. And so that tradition, the apostolic tradition, the divine tradition, is something that each of these great teachers that God has given to the church throughout history has been so important insofar as they kept that apostolic tradition intact. The danger in every age is that we just dismiss the apostolic tradition and create a whole new Christianity de novo out of the head of Zeus or Boltmann or somebody else.
For me as a Christian is always, and I think I hope this captures the attitude of the Reformers. First of all, there's an attitudinal approach to the church's tradition. And I think I want to, although it's very counterintuitive today, countercultural, I want to have a hermeneutic of trust relative to the church's tradition. So by and large, if it says something in a creed that has been held by all Christians for an awful long time in an awful lot of places, I'm going to be inclined to think it's true unless I have very, very compelling reasons for overturning it. So first of all, there's just an attitudinal thing that I don't think Christians should be iconoclastic to the past, which in many ways is exactly what the Socinians were. I've said there were commonalities between the Socinians and the Reformers, but there are also a big difference, and that is the Reformers, they only got rid of the bits of tradition they had to. because Scripture demanded it. They didn't go to tradition with this iconoclastic idea of the whole thing is under suspicion, we need to get rid of it and rebuild from the ground up. So I think a trusting attitude to tradition based in a proper biblical ecclesiology, I think, is important. Secondly, I think before we overturn something like Constantinople or Chalcedon, or the Westminster Confession of Faith, the first thing we need to do is understand these are ecclesiastical documents, and therefore any rejection of them must be done within an ecclesiastical context. That's part of what's going on. Secondly, we need to actually know what they were actually saying in order to reject it. And I think that's where some of the modern doctrine of God stuff really falls down in its tilting at windows. My previous employer made me phone up a leading evangelical theologian whom I'd criticized for rejecting eternal generation, to speak to him about it. And when I was chatting to this person on the phone, I said to him, you say eternal generation on page such and such of your book is nonsense. What have you read from the 4th century that makes you think that? Because an awful lot of Christians have thought that eternal generation did mean something for many hundreds of years. And he responded, well, I haven't read any of the 4th century fathers. Well, I said, what scholarship have you read on the 4th century? To which the answer was, I haven't read any scholarship on the 4th century. To which my response is, I didn't put it in quite these terms, but my response would be, how dare you reject the ecumenical consensus of the church without having done the grunt work necessary to be able to do that? So while I would say these creeds and confessions don't hold scriptural authority, there is a tremendous moral onus on those who seek to reject them to demonstrate categorically that those documents are incorrect. And I might also up the ante and say there's also a moral onus on such people to produce documents that will be just as comprehensive and ecumenical and Catholic for the next 1500 years as the ones, the ecumenical creeds, Nicaea and Chalcedon, they've done the church well for a long, long time. I don't want to get rid of them and replace them with something that's going to be out of date in the middle of next week.
Fair enough.
And then in terms of the second question about theological fragmentation, that is obviously a very big, big subject, but very briefly, let me comment and say that the idea of academic theology was something that is, I think, more or less unknown in Calvin's day, in the sense that being an academic discipline unto itself. These days we have academic conferences, history conferences, journals, where it's almost exclusively about the discipline itself. Whereas in Calvin's day, the vast majority of pastors and theologians, they were serving the church. They were preachers. They were living in and around the church. And theology, as academic as it was not a discipline unto itself, but was ultimately for the service of the church. And so I think that in our own churches, it's so vital today to make sure that all theology, especially in the training of seminarians, is geared for service in the church. That doesn't mean that we can't have academic pursuits and present scholarly papers and write journal articles and what have you. But in the end, we have to love the church, serve the church. And I think in that regard, if we're teachers, we should seek to teach in the church, teaching children's Sunday school even. I once had a child ask me, who's 7 years old, say, why does my Bible say that some of the oldest manuscripts do not contain these verses? And I thought, oh goodness, that's a very difficult question to try to answer to a 7-year-old. How do you explain textual criticism? Foolishly or not, I dove in and did my best to explain that to this 7-year-old child. If we constantly have contact with the people in the church, we will always, God willing, be focused to serving the church and its needs, and never let theology drift away so that it becomes a discipline unto itself. Thank you. My one story, I guess, spans a couple of decades, and I can summarize it as succinctly as possible, is that I felt like when I was going through seminary, I didn't have a mentor. And in fact, most of my professors were hostile to the Reformed faith. And so I considered Dr. Sproul a mentor to me. I would listen to his tapes, audio cassettes. If you don't know what that is, Google it. And these weren't just the conference tapes or the popular stuff, the well-known stuff. These were like the history of theology, the history of philosophy. These were the old ones, I think, back from the Ligonier Valley. And so I felt like I just knew him so well. I would be in the library as a janitor in seminary, listening to Dr. Sproul 3 to 4 hours a night, 5 days a week. And then I'd run out, call home, need more money, send tapes, and they'd send them in. And so, but it wasn't just through the tapes. I would write to him and I'd say, I know you're going to be in town. Any chance that you can, meet for a meal? And he took the time to meet with me and my friends. I didn't eat that morning because I didn't have the money for the buffet because it was too expensive. But my friends ate and then didn't pay. And I was like, you guys, I think you just stiffed Dr. Sproul. I hope that he didn't have to pay for that. I was like, I'm clean because I didn't eat anything. But then I was getting ready to go to grad school. I wrote to him. I said, is there any possibility I could talk to you on the phone and ask you some advice? He took the time out of his busy schedule to talk to me on the phone for like 45 minutes. And that's where, again, I can't do as good a voice as Ken did, but in his, his gruff voice, he's like, pack Turretin, make sure you pack Turretin. I was like, oh, it's already packed, it's going to be in there. But so I just, over the years, it wasn't just at a distance, but, from time to time, he would take that time to, to reach out personally and to connect. Even when I did a D-Min seminar for I guess it was for Ligonier when they had their D-Min, he and his wife took me out to dinner and, they treated me so kindly and were so encouraging. But in all of that, not only does it always teach me to try to, in a sense, fly as high as I can to learn as much as I can, but stay on the ground too, and to try to connect with everybody and anybody.